On February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, bringing a scale of conflict to Europe not seen since World War II. At the time, most experts and commentators believed Russia would achieve a swift and decisive victory. The only real question was how far President Putin would go. The reasoning behind these bold predictions was simple. In one corner, you had Russia, one of the planet's largest and most formidable military powers, led by a seasoned leader. In the other, Ukraine, vastly outmatched in every conceivable way, led by a former comedian, Volodymyr Zelenskyy. But as the weeks and months dragged on, it became abundantly clear. A quick Russian triumph was not happening. And that got me thinking. If a modern global superpower can be held at bay by a much smaller adversary today, what in the world allowed Nazi Germany to become such an unstoppable force in World War II? Think about it. In just a few short months between late 1939 and 1940, Hitler's army somehow conquered half of Europe and a significant chunk of North Africa. Their military strength grew so immense that it took the combined efforts of Britain, the Soviet Union, the USA, and a host of other nations to finally bring them down. When viewed alongside the war in Ukraine, that kind of rapid military dominance simply defies logic. Even more baffling, Hitler's aggressive assault on global freedom came just 2 decades after Germany suffered a crushing defeat in World War I. So, how did the German military snowball so suddenly? And why was the rest of Europe so utterly powerless to stop Hitler's war machine in its initial years? I am glad you asked. After the First World War, Germany posed about as much threat to world peace as a wet noodle. Under the Treaty of Versailles, signed by the newly established Weimar government as part of Germany's surrender, the German military was reduced to a mere 100,000 personnel. Its air force was completely disbanded. After intense political pressure, Germany also accepted full responsibility for the war and agreed to pay billions of dollars in reparations to the rest of Europe. This sounded good in principle, but in practice, Germany was practically penniless. So, the Weimar government devised a genius economic plan to pay off its mounting debts. They started printing money by the truckload. You don't need an economics degree to see where this was headed. All that new currency flooded the German economy, triggering mass hyperinflation. At its worst, 4.2 trillion German marks were worth a single US dollar. If you were a German citizen in the early 1920s, you didn't carry your money in a wallet. You literally needed a wheelbarrow. People actually did that. By 1924, the German economy was in ruins. Industrial output was at an all-time low, and widespread food shortages left millions facing starvation. But just when things seemed dire, help arrived from an unexpected source: the United States, country with which Germany had been at war just 6 years prior. Under what became known as the Dawes Plan, Germany borrowed massive sums from American banks to fund a booming cultural and economic recovery in the mid to late 1920s. Running your country on foreign credit might sound risky, but the Weimar government wasn't worried. They were borrowing from America, the wealthiest, most stable country in the world. What could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, that question had a 3-word answer: the Great Depression. That economic disaster hit the US markets in the summer of 1929, and Germany suddenly found that those friendly American bankers who'd been so generous for the past 5 years were no longer answering their calls. So, to sum it up, by 1930, Germany was essentially bankrupt, without allies, and barely had an army to fight a beehive. And yet, fewer than 10 years later, they would kick off World War II, having somehow transformed themselves into a global superpower with Europe's most feared army. When you put it that way, such a transformation sounds literally impossible. There simply wasn't enough time. Granted, that's completely true. But it turns out the first seeds of recovery had been planted more than a decade before the Great Depression even began. You see, ever since the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Germany had been secretly rebuilding its military capabilities. Under the Weimar government, the German police force was quietly given training and equipment of a distinctly military nature. Paramilitary groups were allowed to grow unchecked into what soon became small private armies, and money was discreetly funneled into the research of forbidden military technologies. At the same time, state-sponsored clubs started appearing all over the country. Publicly, they were perfectly innocent. Sports teams, youth programs, aviation clubs, that sort of thing. But privately, they were little more than military training camps, where potential leaders were identified and future Luftwaffe pilots were primed. An entire generation of Germans was being readied for war behind closed doors. As per the Treaty of Versailles, this was all totally illegal, so these efforts had to be hidden from the international community, which imposed a natural limit on German rearmament. But the arrival of the Great Depression dealt a fiscal death blow to the Weimar Republic. And it's safe to say that the man who took their place did unoverly concern himself with the opinions of Europe. You might have heard of him. He went by Adolf. And when he consolidated power in Germany in 1933, he was well and truly tired of the Treaty of Versailles. In fact, he planned to tear the document into neat little squares. During the mid to late 1930s, Hitler initiated the biggest industrial expansion in Germany's history, as he tuned the entire economy toward a single end: war. Every man, woman, and child with a functional body was put to work for the greater good. Many were funneled into factories producing munitions and vehicles of war. Some worked the fields, and others built massive public projects, including the now famous Autobahns. Hitler paid for all of this with what amounted to little more than financial smoke and mirrors, involving shell companies and shady promissory notes known as MIFO bills. The whole thing was entirely illegal and hopelessly unsustainable. But Hitler wasn't interested in Germany's long-term financial stability. No, he was going to war, and as long as he won, he'd be able to pay off Germany's mounting debt with all the loot. In other words, he was turning Germany into the biggest bully in the playground. He was about to go after the rest of Europe's lunch money. By 1935, Germany's army had tripled to 300,000 men, and its Air Force, something whose very existence was outlawed, boasted 2,500 cutting-edge warplanes. Hitler was unexactly known for his modesty. This is a man who believed his people were part of a master race destined to rule mankind. So he simply couldn't resist showing off his shiny new army to the rest of the world at what he dubbed the Freedom to Rearm rally. Publicly admitting to breaking the treaty was a risky move, but Hitler had come up with a clever excuse. He claimed he was rearming as a purely defensive measure, and that, by doing so, he wasn't threatening European peace, but actually helping to maintain it. That might sound ridiculous, but what happened next was downright insane. People actually believed him. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, it's hard to say exactly why. Perhaps Europe's other political leaders simply underestimated just how dangerous Germany was becoming under Hitler. Or maybe they were too wary of rocking the boat for fear of plunging the world back into war. But no, Hitler put on a literal military parade to boast about his giant illegal army, and the rest of the world simply rolled over, which only served to make the man with the tiny mustache even bolder. By 1939, on the cusp of the biggest war in history, all those years of fevered preparation had borne lethal and abundant fruit. Hitler's army contained more than 4 million soldiers, and his power was absolute. But that alone doesn't entirely explain why Germany was such a juggernaut in the first 2 years of the war. Hitler may have commanded a stronger army than any of his enemies in a one-on-one comparison. But World War II wasn't a singles match. It wasn't even tag team. It was a royal rumble involving more than 50 countries. And the combined forces of the Allies far outnumbered those of the Axis powers from day one. Well, actually, day two. When Hitler fired the World War II starting pistol by invading Poland, it took Britain and France 2 days to decide that might be a problem and declare war. So just 54 hours. Into a war that would last 6 years, the Nazis were vastly outnumbered by the combined forces of the Allies, who also happened to have more money, more resources, more ships, and more planes, more pretty much everything. And yet we've all read the history books. During the early part of the war, this apparent underdog tore through Europe like a genetically enhanced pit bull. In just 19 months, Hitler successfully invaded Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece, with the Allies powerless to stop him. As for how he did it well, it turns out Hitler had a trick up his well-starched sleeve. Just 21 years separated the end of the First World War and the start of the Second, but during that time, warfare had changed forever. The trouble was, only the Germans had actually noticed. World War I was fought largely in the trenches, with long periods of stalemate, as huge forces dug in behind fixed lines. Attacking such heavily defended positions was certainly possible, but it cost the aggressor dearly. However, in World War II, fortified trenches received a huge nerf. Thanks to advances in tanks, planes, and other newfangled weaponry, trenches had become defenseless. German military tactics heavily hinged on these hulking machines, using their speed to surprise enemies with a torrent of tanks and motorized infantry. The objective was to daze the enemy and decimate their defenses. This rapid ground assault was simultaneously supported in the sky by newly designed dive bombers that focused their efforts where enemy resistance was strongest, while also harassing support lines. You probably know this approach to overwhelming the enemy as the famous Nazi Blitzkrieg tactics, a word that literally translates to lightning war. But oddly enough, the term Blitzkrieg was never actually used by the Germans. The term was picked up by Western media and somehow stuck. Anyway, in reality, and contrary to popular belief, foundational principles of Blitzkrieg weren't anything new. The Germans simply combined classic military ideas with modern technology in ways that nobody had ever seen before. The final piece in the devastating Blitzkrieg puzzle was the humble radio. Like tanks, radios were readily used in the First World War, but they were large and unreliable. And their pitiful range made them about as viable as shouting really loudly. But in World War II, radios were much smaller, with much better range. And you don't need to be Sun Tzu to know that effective communication is an incredible asset on the battlefield. And the Germans were quick to adopt the radio as a means to coordinate their devastating Blitzkrieg attacks. Of course, the Allies had access to all these tools too. They just hadn't had the time to figure out how to use them as effectively. At the start of the war, the British didn't have a single dedicated armored division in their entire army. The Poles were still heavily reliant on cavalry. And while the French actually had more tanks than the Nazis, they didn't arrange them in mass ranks like in German panzer divisions, but sprinkled them here and there among their infantry. Most French tanks also lacked radios, meaning they simply had no way to match the seamless coordination of Hitler's ranks. The tactics we now call Blitzkrieg were so effective that they allowed the Nazis to defeat their enemies incredibly quickly, and often with minimal losses. France fell to the Nazi war machine in 6 weeks, Poland in 35 days, and Denmark in just 6 hours. Okay, so we've covered a lot of background in this video, but if I had to sum it all up in a TLDW, it would be this. The Nazis were so unbelievably successful in the first 2 years of World War II because they were better prepared than everyone else. That extra prep time allowed Hitler and his generals to amass a huge, well-equipped army, gain a technological edge over their enemies, and master the nuances of mechanized warfare before anyone else. You have to remember, for years, Hitler knew he was preparing for war, while his neighbors were preparing for peace. This head start proved too powerful for Europe to overcome, and if Hitler hadn't begun to believe his own propaganda, namely, that his army was all but invincible, the Allies might never have caught up. But as it transpired, by the middle of the war, Hitler was no longer a schoolboy looking to steal some lunch money. He more resembled a crazy person trying to start fights with absolutely everyone. In the summer of 1941, Hitler ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union as part of Operation Barbarossa. And 6 months later, he declared war on the United States in the aftermath of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Strong though it was, Nazi Germany didn't have the manpower or the resources to win a truly global war. And yet that's what Hitler ultimately got himself into. It took some time, but eventually, the stronger, larger economies of the Allies started to outproduce those of the Axis powers. Allied defeats became the exception rather than the rule, and thanks to the bravery and sacrifice of countless people from many different countries. One of the darkest periods in human history was finally brought to an end.